I generally respect police officers. I operate under the assumption that they are all good men and good women in uniform. I don't want to defund the police. I don't want to cast aspersions on all police. But I don't back the blue. And I don't even actually know what that specifically means for practical purposes. It kind of just seems to be a thing people say when they don't hate cops. I don't hate cops, but I don't back the blue. Because there are too many law enforcement officers who are willing to do evil or allow evil to be done on their watch, all under the guise of, oh, I was just following orders. And I know that these men and women are willing to put their lives on the line for us. I appreciate that immensely. And I understand that many of them have children. However, I also have mouths to feed, so to speak. I have myself and family members who are struggling and who need my concern and my care. I also need to be able to survive and thrive in this world. And I also have really deep concerns about the fate of this nation, which, make no mistake, we are losing. So there comes a certain point where I can only forgive so much evil that is done by you or that you allowed to be done on your watch because you had to feed your kids. Police officers arrested American citizens who refused to comply with COVID stay-at-home orders. They arrested business owners who refused to comply. They padlocked businesses of owners who refused to comply. They bent the knee with BLM protesters, even though BLM stands for everything antithetical to law and order in a civilized society. And moreover, at the same time, their compatriots were burning down and terrorizing American cities. But police bent the knee with them anyway. And the final straw, really, not the final straw, but really the thing that caused me to turn on the camera right now, is this past week we saw at San Francisco Pride, police officers, more than one, stand idly by saying that they have been told to choose their battles, standing idly by while grown naked men perform adult acts on each other involving mouths and urine and male body parts. Just letting it happen on the streets of San Francisco out in broad daylight with kids nearby. And that is not even the first time that cops have stood by while under the banner of pride, illegal activity happens on the streets, lewd and lascivious activity happens on the streets, criminal activity, evil activity, things that kids should not be seeing, just happens on the streets under the banner of pride, and cops allow it because they're just following orders. If cops in New York or, say, Florida were told tomorrow to take Donald Trump into custody, there would be cops who would do that because they'd just be following orders. And there are just too many law enforcement officers, not all, but too many, who are cowards, who, if it means a paycheck and a pension, they are willing to commit evil, or they are willing to stand by while the evil, not to mention criminal, activity is committed. And it'll all be under the excuse of, I was just following orders. Well, you know what? They were also just following orders in 1930s Germany. At a certain point, that isn't actually an excuse. And don't get me wrong, I want everyone to be able to feed their kids. I don't want anyone's kids to starve or suffer. But frankly, I don't want you to be able to feed your kids at the expense of our very nation. If a police officer is told to do something that he knows is wrong, he needs to fight that with every resource available to him, from the bottom to the top of his department to the highest person he can get to. And if that fight proves ineffective, he has to resign. He should resign. And I understand that it is easier said than done. I really actually do get that. I understand. But you cannot do evil under the guise of feeding your children. And we live in a prosperous nation. Moreover, there are other avenues to feed your children, to keep a roof over their heads. Now, it might not be easy. Like I said, it might mean a huge sacrifice, but it is possible to do the right thing. And I'm not a cop with a kid at all. But I am someone who lives paycheck to paycheck, who does not have a lot of resources, who does not have money to fall back on, does not have wealthy family members, mom and dad, to fall back on. And I lost jobs, multiple jobs, because I refused to take the COVID shot. So I know a little something about sacrificing in a material, tangible way in order to do what you know is right. And at a certain point, feeding your kids isn't going to matter if they end up living out under the boot when they're adults. And worse yet, you put them there. Because anything that you don't fight today, any evil that you allow to happen, any tyranny that you allow to happen, and you look the other way, your kids are going to have to fight that 100 times harder than you would have had to if you would just stand up now, or they're going to have to lick the boot. You cannot commit evil under the guise of feeding your kids. You are ceding your kids to the enemy. You are ceding your kids to hell. And it's actually really selfish, because at that point, you're going to be long gone or too old to actually give a hoot, and your kids are going to be suffering. They're going to be living under tyranny. They're going to be living under communism. They're going to be living under the boot. They're going to be living in hell, all because their mother and especially their father were both too weak to stand up and fight for what they knew was right, to fight for more than just their stomachs. And actually, this applies beyond law enforcement officers, obviously, because we all at times get tempted to be weak and compliant and to turn a blind eye and go along to get along. But I'm tired of seeing weak men and weak women in uniform. I really am. Don't ask me to look at you as a hero if you're anything but. Don't ask me for additional respect or backing the blue if you don't actually deserve it. Men and women who are willing to sell out for a paycheck are a dime a dozen, and that is part of why we are where we are as a nation, and it's part of why we are losing our country. Because the powers that be know that they have you over a barrel if they threaten your livelihood or your paycheck. Because, of course, we're all good people and we all want our kids to not only survive, but to thrive. But at a certain point, you also have to think long term. You have to think, okay, I'm feeding my kids, but what kind of world am I giving them? Are they going to grow up in a world better than the one I grew up in? Or at least just as good? Or are they going to grow up in one that is evil and tyrannical? And this is an obvious point, but it bears repeating because it is so fundamentally true. The more people who stand up, the easier it is for everyone to stand up. If more people had stood up against masks and shots, it would have been so much easier for those of us who did. And if police officers in San Francisco last weekend, I'm not saying that none did. I don't know. But if more had stood up, if any had stood up and said, no, actually, we're not going to allow on our watch for grown men to blow and pee on each other while kids are nearby, how much easier it would have been. That pride parade wouldn't have gone on without law enforcement protection. It couldn't have gone on. It's not just about feeding kids, which it's so important to feed kids, obviously, and for them to survive and thrive and be happy and be well. But it's also about, what are we doing to the kids? What are we allowing the kids to see? What kind of world are we giving them? So I just can't back the blue. I'm sorry. I really, really can't. Not until this kind of thing stops.